Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. You are here in iHouse. This is the Great Hall. It is a beautiful forum. And here we host global forums, which are weekly events that focus globally oriented speakers and topics. Next month, we'll have a couple more globally oriented topics, but given that this is one of our first series this year. With that, my name is Mina Nguyen, and I am a program intern here at iHouse. I am a second year, and I'm happy to welcome the next Associate Director and Professor and Director of Pacific Leadership Fellows Program, John Alquist, to the stage.
Thank you, and greetings. Welcome to those of you who made the trek out to terrible La Jolla this evening, a beautiful fall day. So I'm John Alquist. I'm a faculty member here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, and it's my pleasure to kick us off this evening. So our talk tonight is going to be Allies and Partners, Indo-Pacific Strategy in a Shifting International Order. It's sponsored by the Peter Cowie Center for Global Transformation, Global Leadership Fellows Program, which I helped to direct. And it is also, we're proud to acknowledge the Korea Pacific Program at GPS and the Global Forum Program as co-sponsors of this event. So thanks for their support. Always great to collaborate. And we also want to thank all of you for your continued engagement and generosity. It's great to see so many of you coming out on a weeknight. But in particular, also our founding supporters, Joan and Erwin Jacobs, our dedicated staff, our colleagues at GPS and elsewhere, and the community of friends and scholars and former leadership fellows here and around the world. Before we jump into tonight's main event, I want to let you know there will be another. It's coming on the 20th. Our Global Leadership Fellow in residence, Bob Kahn, will be giving a talk on the role of philanthropy in science. And that will be presented here in this very room, and there will be registration information going out shortly for those of you on the mailing list. And I'm pretty sure everyone here is on the mailing list, but if you would like to be and you're not, you can talk to our staff in the front and they'll make sure you get a minimal amount of spam, just useful stuff. By way of housekeeping, we're gonna have about a 25-minute talk, and I'm sure you'll have a million questions in your head while it's going on. That's fantastic. Write them down and hold them till the end, please. We'll have a moderated Q&A that will happen at the end. That will be moderated by the Lawrence and Sally Krauss Distinguished Professor Emeritus, Director Emeritus of the Korea Pacific Program, and the newly minted Revelle Medal Award winner. That's the highest honor UC San Diego gives to faculty, by the way, Steph Haggard. So thank you for doing that, Steph. And there'll be some light refreshments following the Q&A. So without any more housekeeping, let me turn to our guest this evening. Allison Hooker is a seasoned foreign policy and national security specialist, having spent over 20 years in the US government, primarily focused on concerns in Asia. She's currently serving as a senior vice president for the American Global Strategies, but she's held key roles as deputy assistant to the president, as a senior advisor for Asia in the National Security Council, where she led U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific region, coordinating closely with the rest of the intelligence community, as well as our allies and partners in the region. Previously, she served as special assistant to the president and senior director for the Korean Peninsula, where she was central in shaping the U.S. policy towards both North and South Korea during major diplomatic engagements, including the U.S.-North Korea summit. Before the White House, she was a senior analyst of North Korea in the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence, where she was involved in the 6-party talks on North Korea's nuclear program. She holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from fantastic places. She spent time in Japan, but I don't want to take up any more of her time. I want to hand it over to Allison Hooker.
Fantastic. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here tonight. And I'd like to say, thank you, John, for a very warm and welcoming introduction. I also would love to say thank you, Steph, for, along with the Global Policy and School of Global Policy and Strategy, the Center for Global Transformation, Dean Freund, and Professor Almquist and also Professor Josh Graf-Ziven for this extraordinary opportunity to get out of Washington, D.C. this week and to join you here in beautiful, sunny Southern California. I can't tell you how great it is to get out. I have been on the road quite a bit in Asia for the past few months, but even that feels like a pressure cooker because everything that everyone wants to ask is about what's going to happen in the election. And if I knew that, we'd all be rich right now because we'd be placing bets. But anyway, it's great to be here, and what a truly refreshing and stimulating experience it is to be here at UCSD, to speak with faculty, to speak with students, is a unique opportunity, and I'm very grateful for it. As a young intelligence analyst, just starting work on North Korea, Steph Haggard's books were on my shelves as resources, and it's hard for me to believe that it actually took almost 20 years for us to meet in person, which was February of 23. But it's been great fun to engage with you, Steph, and great fun to have these conversations. I look forward to our conversation today, and thanks for hosting me here this week. I should also acknowledge Susan Shirk, who, not here tonight, but with whom I've crossed paths many times. She departed the U.S. State Department just right before I started in January 2001. But of course, and we've crossed paths many times, but her work on China and North Korea was very influential throughout my career and continues to be so today. So I hope to see Susan again sometime soon. But to jump into the conversation tonight, I'd like to do roughly three things around the broader topic of U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific. First, I'll do a brief reminder of the legacy architecture of the legacy structure of those alliances and why this structure, of course known as hub and spoke model, formed in that way. Second, I'll talk about how those alliances have evolved and perhaps more importantly, why they have evolved and what factors are contributing to that evolution. And third, I'll talk about why this is both important and beneficial to the United States, no matter what the outcome of next week's election is. And these alliances, in their evolved architecture, the way they're arrayed will persist in both their importance, their benefit to the U.S., and that's the plan, at least for the talk I plan to give tonight. We'll see how it goes. And before I do that, just a couple of additional comments on background. It's fun to talk to students as I've done over the past couple of days, and had the great opportunity to do previous visits as well. And one of the first questions I get asked by nearly everyone is, why North Korea? How North Korea? How U.S. government? Well, I'm from a small town in middle Georgia. It's called Macon, Georgia, and known for Little Richard was born in Macon. If you're a fan of, if even know who Little Richard is, and if you're a fan of Southern rock, the Allman Brothers, also from Macon, and also buried in Macon. But not much about Asia is going on, at least in those days, in Macon, Georgia. So the way basically the short version of the story is, as a young person, as a preteen, I would say, even in the 70s and 80s, to date myself. But I very much interested in international affairs, watching the nightly news, Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, Cold War, what's happening. For whatever reason, very, very interested in that, drawn to that, and thought, how am I ever gonna do that kind of work? What do you do to do that? And that continued for a while. Again, I was just in high school, but when I was 17, my hometown has a sister city relationship with a small town in Japan on the Japan seaside or East Sea side, depending on how you want to call it. And I had the opportunity to do about a month in Japan as a 17-year-old to experience, the sister city, but also get around to other parts of Japan. And honestly, it was my own personal pivot to Asia. It changed my life. So very, very much supportive of study abroad and abroad experiences, and say that to students all the time. If you have an opportunity to get out and do something like that, go. Figure out what's interesting to you. Let that drive your future work. And so, with that as kind of a starting point, focused on, learning Japanese, went back and forth several times, including during graduate school, as John mentioned, and, focused on, and this is the reason why it's important also, because it was the doorway to Korea for me, but focused on the relationship between Japan from the Meiji period leading up into the annexation of Korea by Japan, how that happened, very much part of what I was interested in. Did that work. Again, that's not government work, but followed my heart on that and did that. Decided not to pursue a PhD program, and happy to talk to students about that as well. But it went back to what my heart was. I wanted to work for the U.S. government. How am I going to do that? Didn't yet know. But when the year I finished that final research fellowship at Osaka University on those issues I just talked about, I came home and learned of an opening at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research as a Japan analyst. I thought, this is it. This is exactly the perfect thing for me. Applied, learned they had someone else in mind for that position when they posted it. No problem. For whatever, luck, fortune, they brought me on anyway to do a regional position, regional analysis. I would have swept the floors, as a young, fresh out of school person interested in Asia. I really would have done whatever they asked. But on day one, my supervisor said, "Would you work on North Korea?" Absolutely. And all of my sort of Cold War fantasies and interest, really, all those bells went off. Because at that moment, in January of 2001, the global landscape looked very different, right? And North Korea, oddly, was really the only threat, that had a Cold War flavor to it. And so I began my work on North Korea. And it was that work that I think first allowed me to see U.S. Indo-Pacific alliances in action, often tested and strained, but performing often at their peak capacity. Countries coming together to deter, protect, and defend against a common threat. Through those experiences, either as a delegation member on six-party talks, as an analytical support for negotiators, or negotiations that led up to what we called the Leap Day deal on North Korea, other engagements around the North Korea problems. I witnessed a great deal of alliance engagement and learned a lot about challenges of coordination and cooperation, consultation, learned a lot about that, and also the benefits. And it turned out to be extraordinarily useful education. But at the end of the day, a threat like North Korea, it was a great unifier, a catalyst for action and forcing cooperation among allies and partners, often in spite of great differences. So, in thinking about those alliances, let's just take a brief look at the legacy alliance architecture. There are so many of you here that have a better command of that history and of that topic than perhaps I do. But as we know, the classic hub and spoke model of bilateral alliances in the region dominated post-war Indo-Pacific security architecture. There are a number of theories why specifically it was hub and spoke model that emerged. Some say the U.S. preferred the bilateral model because Washington could control allies more efficiently through a hub and spoke structure. And others say that the ally countries preferred hub and spoke because it allowed direct access to Washington without the involvement of other countries that perhaps they had problematic bilateral relationships with. I'm thinking, obviously, Japan and Korea is a perfect example of that. Or deeply held historical grievances. And that would have prevented the kind of engagement necessary for a really effective multilateral alliance. The truth somewhere, it's somewhere in between those two things, particularly as the history shows the U.S. continued to try to build a multilateral security alliance in the region. We have 1954 initiative of Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was founded like NATO to combat communism in Asia, never quite worked out. And basically in Asia, lots of different things going on, very different from Europe. The interest of the member states and the differences of their perceptions of threat, the common threat, did not contribute to working into a functional organization. So that all fizzled out. All those efforts fizzled out, and for the reasons I just stated. So what we've seen actually, and moving into kind of current evolution, is that though this hub and spoke model was maintained throughout the Cold War period, we've seen it evolve. And as the region has evolved, and even as the world has evolved, we've seen the emergence of several groupings of countries, traditional bilateral alliances, kind of remaining intact and important, but also collaborating together, coalescing around emerging and developing threats as we're seeing, pooling capabilities, and many of the other benefits of multilateral security organizations that perhaps the U.S. had been aiming for, other countries aiming for, but couldn't quite get to work. And examples, which we'll talk about through the body of this presentation, but just loosely, speaking, listing them out: the U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation, which is working at this moment quite well. U.S., Japan, Philippines cooperation, U.S., Japan, Australia, what we call the TSD, the Trilateral Security Dialogue, AUKUS, and the Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, India quadrilateral dialogue. Again, none of these are formal alliances, but many-lateral cooperation dialogues, and yet they represent a significant development in the regional architecture, one that's both beneficial and necessary to protecting and advancing U.S. interests in the region. I've heard this kind of emerging structure referred to as a nodal system, or maybe even a spider web structure of architecture of alliances, and maybe it's appropriate to talk about spider webs the day before Halloween, but I had not actually seen that reference before kind of looking into this, but some are talking about that. But the point is that these clusters of allies and partners that are connected through overlapping formal, informal, bilateral, minilateral, and multilateral linkages are organized around threats and interests, and sort of led by a hub in the region, but also with the United States remaining the security guarantor. So I think this is the idea of this emerging alliance structure in the Indo-Pacific, and thinking about Indo-Pacific strategy, sort of the base of what I wanted to talk about. But how do we get from hub and spoke into that? Why was there change? What are the factors that are contributing to that evolution? And I'd propose there are basically 5 factors, sort of 2 and one of them that has sort of 2 sub things, but I just broke it out into 5. 5 factors we can consider that have shaped the emerging alliance structure in the Indo-Pacific. Number 1, the evolving threats. They're increasing, they're growing, however you want to phrase it, but they have evolved, and they're galvanizing effort. Number 2, it's actually leadership. Who are the heads of state that are making the decision for their countries, and that matters, as we will talk about. And how those leaders have changed in certain countries has certainly contributed to the kind of groupings that have formed. Number three, the advancement of U.S. ally capabilities has also contributed to this. And that's under, sort of the leadership issue, because leaders will decide how to advance their capabilities in such a way to allow for greater cooperation with the United States and other countries in the region. And number four, the improvement of regional relationships, also very connected to leaders' decisions. And finally, five, the evolving world order. So on the nature of threats, I think there are lots of things to talk about here. I mentioned how North Korea had been a natural unifier and over the years of effort and among our allies. Ever since Pyongyang's pursuit of nuclear weapons capabilities was discovered in the 90s, that has been true, and it's continued to do so. Now we have North Korea sending troops to Russia, something I don't think we could have imagined. I certainly couldn't have imagined in 2001 when I started to analyze North Korea and leadership decision-making process. But now that is really a snapshot of how the threat is expanding in ways we could not have imagined. But it's precisely this evolution of threat which will continue to foster cooperation among our allies and partners in these kind of minilateral, small multilateral, and trilateral groupings, and shaping how allies are responding in the region. I think the other major threat that we have to talk about when considering the impact on alliance architecture in the region is, of course, the China threat. And I imagine you've all heard a great deal about that, but it's the emergence of China as an aggressive actor in the region and beyond that has been one of the greatest catalysts for cooperation among allies, among U.S. allies and partners and like-minded states, perhaps the greatest catalyst since the Cold War. Whether it's increasingly aggressive actions in South China Sea, the East China Sea, around Taiwan, economic coercive behavior deployed against states which perhaps speak differently than Beijing might want them to about certain issues, or an accelerated military modernization. These are the kind of things that are producing, I would say, unity is not the right word, but it's producing collective action among our allies and partners in the region. And whether it's the goal of achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, or Beijing's approach to what the global tech field and something they called Made in China 2025 strategy, which aimed to displace the United States as the global leader. There is an effort to, I think, not just me, obviously, but a great effort to take action that would require the revision of the international order in support of their system of governance and national interests. And that's a quote from Xi Jinping. So thinking about that, it's these kind of concerns that spurred the reinvigoration of concept of free and open Indo-Pacific, which was originally former and late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's concept, which some of my former colleagues in the Trump administration may say that we stole, but we did pick that up, reform it, expand it, make it our own, and worked that into what became the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework. It's declassified, it's available online. I have a copy in my binder, something that I think is worth taking a look at, because not just because of what it galvanized in the Trump administration, but frankly because it has resulted in sort of an awareness and spurred the creation of many of the minilateral groupings that we're talking about, including Quad, AUKUS, the Philippines trilateral with the United States and Japan, among others. So, in contrast to early periods, it was the lack of a common threat perception, or the lack of a real big threat to sort of work around. But we're seeing the increasing overlap of countries' threat perception that's contributing to the evolution of alliances in the region. Number two, and moving on, leadership matters. And a second factor, as I mentioned, contributing to the evolution of our alliances and the structure of that in the Indo-Pacific is the individual leadership style. Some examples, I just mentioned Prime Minister Abe and Free and Open Indo-Pacific, but also Scott Morrison, former Prime Minister of Australia, and his efforts to push forward the Quad. I have the privilege of working with Scott Morrison now. He's a member of our firm, my consulting firm we work at. And it's great to talk to him about those early days of trying to form the Quad and the various obstacles to that. But in addition to Mr. Morrison, Prime Minister Modi's involvement with the Quad as well, and you can look at President Marcos as a change from President Duterte in the Philippines, and what kind of changes in policy and approach to not just U.S. alliance, but to the region and regional partnerships. You can certainly see that change very stark when leaders come on the scene, new leaders come on the scene. I think another really great example, obviously, is President Yoon in South Korea. A massive change of approach. People don't agree with everything, but you have to acknowledge that it's been Yoon's change of approach to foreign policy and where South Korea, stands, takes its place on the international stage. Concepts like global pivotal state, his move to work with former Prime Minister Kishida to dramatically improve relations with Japan, decisions to sell arms to Eastern European countries like Poland as a result of the war on Ukraine by Russia. These things required personal leadership on Yoon's part and would not have happened if he had not taken the risky initiative to move down that path. Just a couple more points on the leadership aspect. President Biden and his administration and the work done on the trilateral relationship between Japan, Korea, and the United States. Camp David Summit, groundbreaking, really important thing that took place, and the work that went into that, again, commending Yoon and Kishida, very important on the part of the Biden administration to go that distance, to offer Camp David. I will say that in the Trump administration and prior to that, a lot of work was done to lay groundwork for something like that summit taking place. Often wrangling with allies. Perhaps it was wrangling with South Korea because they didn't, relationship with Japan at the time was much more fraught. And anything we did, we had to keep out of the press and secret because our South Korean colleagues did not want that work to be made known. But some very important work was done to keep that relationship moving forward. And just a final point, on the Indo-Pacific strategic framework itself, it's under President Trump that we actually took the step to form that framework. It was a very controversial and I'd say groundbreaking policy framework at the time, but set in motion because of an acknowledgement of what was happening with regard to the China threat. And it was a framework of how to respond to that threat alongside allies, partners, and like-minded countries, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but globally throughout Europe, Africa, Latin America, et cetera. And now many countries have their own Indo-Pacific strategies that are centered around managing, countering, and dealing with that threat. I think I can certainly say that I'm not sure a similar such policy would have emerged when it did under a different U.S. president. Number 3, moving on. Capabilities of allies are improving. The decisions of these heads of states to move their country in a direction to improve their capabilities, making them more able to engage with the United States, let's say, in security cooperation, cybersecurity, intelligence sharing, all of that. We have seen a shift in that because of the decisions of leaders. And some of that I've already mentioned. I won't spend a lot of time on it. Abe and Kishida, it's in reaction to the emerging and growing, their perception of emerging and growing threat in China, subsequently in their administrations, that and also with North Korea always being relevant in the picture. But it is in reaction to that you see policies in Japan beyond free and open Indo-Pacific, but pushing towards increased defense spending and culminating in the decision to double defense expenditures by 2027, the new national security strategy and the counter-strike capability that also came out of both of those administrations, and also Japan's decision to support Taiwan. But my point is that these decisions to increase capability, there are others, President Park Geun-hye in South Korea in 2015, decision to bring on a deployment of THAAD, which was very costly for the South Korean government and corporations at the time, but that also allowed greater cooperation. It's a threat, it's the perception of threat, individual leadership, and how that leadership is deciding to expand the capacity to cooperate that's really also shaping the alliance structure. 4th, relationships between allies are improving. We've talked about some of that. Japan, Korea, such a great example of that. But I would also say Japan, Philippines, and also the Quad. There are stories to tell here, but I definitely would say this is a contributor to our to the changing scene, the changing horizon of our engagements in the Indo-Pacific, and is a direct result of leadership decisions. And finally, number 5, the international order is in flux. While I believe the Western-led rules-based international order is the best order for protecting and advancing U.S. threats and those of our allies and our like-minded partners, the U.S.-China great power competition in particular, and what some are calling, the axis of dictators or axis of chaos, referring to Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China, is they're seriously seeking to displace and change the existing order. You will not be surprised that I don't accept the assertion that the rise of China and decline of the United States is inevitable. I see that the U.S. Remains fundamentally strong, but it will be the decisions of our own leader going forward that shape how we channel and cultivate that strength. In terms of the ability to deter and defend against the challenges, the threats that have emerged and increased in recent years that are allowing for the changing architecture, there are gaps in our armor, and we should be actively working to refill these gaps, which will take time, but and treasure and strategic decisions to accomplish. But it's the emerging relationships and partnerships and alliance, again, architecture and structure in the Indo-Pacific, in particular, because that's what I'm talking about, that can help us fill these gaps in the meantime and potentially in the future as well. So just to recap and sum up, it's the legacy hub and spoke architecture of bilateral alliances in the Indo-Pacific that has evolved into a different construct, whether it's a nodal, you call it a nodal system, spiderweb structure, whatever, of formal alliances and informal arrangements that show up as minilateral dialogues that involve traditional bilateral alliances, often meshing 2 or more together with other partners to address new and existing but growing security threats. That seems to be what's happening. And this change is a result of the 5 factors that we've walked through. The threats, leaders' decisions, capabilities, and capacities, improvements in regional relationships, and an evolving, perhaps shifting world order. This new structure is beneficial to the United States because of a few factors. There's strength in numbers. I know this is probably very obvious, but particularly with regard to countering China or managing the China threat. These alliances and arrangements are force multipliers, quite literally. Sometimes other partners are able, and also sometimes other partners are able to accomplish things in a region that are uncomfortable for the U.S. To do because they are locally, they are one of the countries. They are part of the Indo-Pacific. Well, we are too. We're a Pacific power. Anyway, as my final point, and regardless of who wins the election, this evolved and still evolving alliance architecture will continue, and it will be important to and beneficial to the protection and advancement of U.S. interests and of U.S. interests in the region and beyond. I'm happy to talk further about why I think that will be the case, particularly in a second potential Trump administration, or any other aspect of this presentation during the question and answer section. And a final point, if you go to church, it's like my third closing. I would say, there are many important things that we haven't talked about and that we should, but we don't have time for. It's the impact of COVID on the international order. It's the impact of COVID on these relationships and sort of what COVID did to spur some of this or accelerate it. It's ASEAN and the Pacific Islands and where they fit, and because they are very important in the whole thing. It's economic security being national security, and so I don't mean to leave that out. And in my mind, it's grouped in there as well. But as I said, there's a lot to cover. Thank you for your attention and for coming tonight. And I truly look forward to the conversation with Steph and your questions. Thanks very much.
Is that on? Yeah, great. So, I'm going to do something, but only for a few minutes, because the last thing that anyone wants at this moment is for me to stand up here and have a conversation with Allison when you can be posing questions. But I thought I would get us going because you have an experience throughout the region and also on Korea by just asking two questions. So the first is, I really agree that something is happening in the regional architecture that's quite unusual. I mean, there's just been this flurry of innovation. And I think China really does sit at the center of it in a very central way because it's a reaction in part to perceived risks on that side. But I have two concerns, I guess, about the argument. One is I worry that the capitals in Asia aren't necessarily aligned with the United States in exactly the way that we think. And that each of those capitals is much more deeply embedded in a Chinese regional economy, and it's much more difficult for them to maintain the same level of independence that a Japan or a United States has. And Korea is actually quite interesting in that regard because, of course, it's really still reasonably dependent on China, though that dependence is falling in interesting ways. So that's one concern. I mean, are we over-interpreting these shifts as meaning an alignment with U.S. policy? But the other side is, and this is maybe somewhat more controversial, but is the extent to which some of this is actually hedging against the United States. I mean, or hedging risks associated with the United States and looking elsewhere in the region partly because of concerns about whether the United States will remain committed. And I say that across administrations, actually. I mean, it could be both administrations that might see somewhat less commitment. So maybe that'll get us going. And then I have one question on Korea.
Sure. I think both very good comments, and where to start. So sure, I think that I would just use the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework as and our work on that during that time, several years ago. It wasn't necessarily that we found, and I don't mean to portray it that way. It's easy to gloss over things, when you're talking, but we did find varying levels of interest, agreement, and desire to be engaged with the U.S. on this issue. And particularly, at that time, think about 2018, 2017, not so clear exactly what was going on, very, different time. But I don't mean to sidestep your question, but I guess I'm looking at it from aligned objectives, maybe, not necessarily that these countries will continue to be, red-blooded, apple pie eating, allies of the United States in that for those reasons, but our interests do align at the moment. And, what we saw was as the effort to really, again, this was all done privately, not publicly. This is going to Europe, even going to Latin America, some of the other places, but also to the Indo-Pacific, particularly with regard to free and open Indo-Pacific. And that is a kind of unifying factor to identify what we did have in common and sort of focus on that. So, I don't mean to draw solid lines when there should be dotted lines, but I think that overlapping interests will continue to shape, U.S. engagement in the region and their desire to engage with the U.S. And I have to say that, still I go to places where I don't expect to hear, we really want the U.S. here, and yet I continue to hear it. So I don't know what all that means. I don't have a way of, sort of doing a scientific, study on it, but this is, basically, from experiences that I'm having. To your point to your question or your, what was your second question?
Well, I just made the observation that some of this may be hedging.
Yes, hedging. Yes, I was holding that in this part of my brain. Sure. I don't disagree with that. For now, I think that a lot of it could be hedging, should be hedging, is hedging. Particularly, you think about we could use South Korea as an example. The interest in a potential, I don't mean to throw a grenade here, but the interest in a potential indigenous nuclear program in South Korea is because they're not sure they can count on extended deterrence, or is a potential second Trump administration going to pull out troops? They have to be able to think about defending themselves, and I understand that, and I can see how that would be driving the Philippines and also Japan as far back as Prime Minister Abe in 2016, 2017, talking again about free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, as we used to call it. But anyway, I can understand that. But at the moment, whether that's the intention, the real reason or not, we still have aligned interests, and we should be organizing and operating around them.
So I can't help asking about Korea. One of the reasons that I always have fun when Alice is in town is she's got just an incredible depth of knowledge about our efforts to engage North Korea. So I have to ask, I think most of us just think denuclearization is just obviously not in the cards. But that doesn't mean the United States should be doing nothing on this issue. And I'm curious what you think an approach could possibly look like. Is there some room to try to pull North Korea away from its engagement with China and Russia at the level it's now taking, or are we really just in a containment world and a sanctions enforcement world?
Yeah, that is obviously very, very good and pertinent question. Also one that I've been thinking about personally and get asked a lot. I'm not sure I have good answers, but I think a couple of things are necessary for any sort of, hope of future good things happening with North Korea. Number one is that the war between Russia and Ukraine has to come to an end. And obviously for a lot of reasons that needs to happen. But if that happens, when that happens, I think that this relationship between Russia and North Korea will naturally kind of unlace. And what I mean by that is that they are dependent on one another at the moment. Putin is, we can speculate what is being given in exchange for now North Korean bodies, which again, not something I would have had on my bingo card for this year or any year. But I think that if the war ends and Putin no longer needs North Korea's bullets, bombs, and bodies, then I don't think he's going to pay much attention to Pyongyang anymore. He's going to be trying to rebuild, parts of his country, depending on how the war actually ends. So I think that has to happen, and if that happens, I think we have a chance at perhaps building leverage on North Korea again. I think about things that were successful with North Korea, things like under the very end of President Obama, what we call the global pressure campaign, which was enforcement, global efforts to really energize and coordinate global implementation of UN Security Council and unilateral sanctions on North Korea. Well, that under President Trump became the maximum pressure campaign, which you may associate more with Iran if you're paying attention to that, but we had the first one. We had the first maximum security, maximum pressure campaign, and it did produce pressure on North Korea, and I believe part of that was what drove them ultimately to the summits and to the table in 2018, 2019. So, I'm honestly not an advocate for sanctions. I think sanctions are fraught with, complexity, and should we be using them, and we shouldn't be using them, maybe as often or the way we are. But when I think about what could possibly, get us back into a position of being able to build leverage on North Korea, both of those things are I think, going to be necessary. And also China. Because both China and Russia are currently helping with sanctions evasion on North Korea, and that's how they're getting to do what they do. So, both of those things are necessary. You didn't say denuclearization, but I assume the question also leads to that: is denuclearization of North Korea possible? And frankly, absent some massive change in the leaders, again, back to leaders, agency on choosing what direction their country is going, absent some change in the leadership mindset on that, I can't imagine a walking back, absent extraordinary crushing pressure or threat of military action. So.
Well, look, I'm going to step aside so that we can get people in. I have a marginal preference for calling on students if they put their hands up, but why don't we just take questions for the rest of the time, and I'll sort of pull back. Is there anyone over here? Please, Dan. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe the Executive World Affairs Council, indeed, the collaboration between Russia and North Korea certainly wasn't on, to this degree, wasn't on very many bingo cards. Yet in that frozen conflict on the Korean Peninsula, it really presents some interesting conundrums for the various countries in the region. What do you see as the implications for China?
Yeah, great question. Well, I am sure others already think this as well. I mean, I would posit that China is very uncomfortable with what's happening between Moscow and Pyongyang at the moment, and have been for the better part of the last year, as Kim made his trip into Vladivostok, and then Putin paid a reciprocal visit. This deepening of ties between Russia and North Korea, I think, has to make China feel like it's on the outside, and I think that's part of the point, actually, of both Pyongyang and Moscow. What I mean by that is China has a unique, has enjoyed, I could say, a unique position of having great leverage over North Korea, whether that's through the provision of fuel or food or trade. There's actual trade going on between the two countries, quite a great deal. I think 90% of North Korea's trade is with China. But what you have now is Russia also providing fuel and food, know-how, technical know-how, we think. I don't know exactly what's in exchange for all of that, but what that does, to a certain degree, not a complete degree, is reduce China's leverage and control, perceived control over North Korea. And I think that makes Beijing uncomfortable. I think also, Xi Jinping, although he's, engaging with Putin, and they're not going to show any fissures publicly, but I think it makes him feel, on the outside of that, whatever decision-making process is going on there. And I think that has to make, again, it causes some great discomfort for Chinese leadership, for Xi Jinping in particular. So, there's more I could say there. I think China's wondering what's happening, inside North Korea. I've had opportunity, which has been great, to engage with Chinese scholars, Chinese subject matter experts that perhaps I knew and during government times, but through think tank work, and also a unique opportunity to speak with Russian subject matter experts as well, and to see the dynamic there and the questions that we would get from China about what's happening indicates that they don't really know. That Beijing isn't in on exactly what's happening between their two neighbors. I'm happy about that.
I saw one here sitting in the back, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for coming to give this talk. I'm a resident here at International House, and so when I saw this was happening, I was like, whoa, crazy. So I am just an undergraduate student. I've been interested in studying this region for a long time, but I haven't exactly had the chance to. However, one perk of being here is that we're right next to the GPS, and so I've been to a lot of the public lectures that have been held here. Just recently, we had Fareed Zakaria come and give a talk. And a lot of these speakers here, which have talked about China and our relationship with them and our strategy in the Indo-Pacific, a lot of them were saying that some of the opinions being thrown around in Washington, some of the positions we're taking are maybe a little bit too hawkish, and that even though to some it might appear that China is being too aggressive and trying to reshape the world order, they're not exactly in a position to do that right now, and that's not exactly in their long-term goals. And so from how I interpreted your talk, you're kind of on the opposite side of that. So I was just wondering, how would you respond to some of the analysts and policymakers who are on the other side of this debate? And how do you think our kind of growing network in the Indo-Pacific is going to tie into our future relationship, bilateral relationship with China, like managing our diplomacy and making sure there isn't a giant conflict that blows up?
Great question. And I was at that Fareed Zakaria talk as well. I think this is the same time. It was during the China forum that happened here, and I had the opportunity to attend. And I remember sitting there, and I think the way he phrased it was, China's not capable of being the threat that many sort of perceive it to be. I guess what I would say is, when Xi Jinping himself talks about what China's goals are and their objectives, we should listen to him. I walked through some of those quotes, and I think whether it's economic coercive behavior in Australia or South Korea or Lithuania, because Taiwan. I understand Taiwan is a sensitive issue, and it doesn't even have to be about Taiwan. It can be about something completely different. It's about, let's go back to THAAD. That's a long time ago now, but I think we saw, a slice of Chinese intentions there to cripple a conglomerate, and just because again, I understand this is debatable, but and believe me, I walked through a lot of those debates internally in our own system, but because a counter-missile system deployed in South Korea, aimed at North Korea, with very clear explanations on how and why that was not about China, but yet, actions taken, again, to cripple an entire corporation there. To, looking at narratives in, let's say, Professor Lake and I were talking about this just yesterday or the day before, looking at narratives, content of overseas newspapers in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia that portray U.S. actions in a certain way, building a narrative about the United States that is incorrect. What's the point of that? What's the intention there? So we could talk about this. There are a lot of ways to come at this, but I do disagree with Mr. Zakaria, respectfully. But I think there's a lot more going on there, and that it's important to counter it. Doesn't have to mean we go to war with China. It just means we have to be prepared to counter it, and the various vectors that they're taking action, and that our allies and partners should be able to do that too. One piece of the Indo-Pacific strategic framework, and maybe I'm just nostalgic from working on it, but one of the lines in there, hopefully I can get it right now, but one of the lines basically says, we want our allies, partners, like-minded, and not just that, just countries in the Indo-Pacific and around the world to be in a position to operate freely, free from coercion, and to be able to make their own decisions on how they engage with China or other countries in the region, to be able to choose. It's not the U.S. going to Indonesia and say, it's us or them, you have to make the choice. No, it's that actually these countries are able to stand up and be able to make that choice, feel strong enough to make that choice, free from coercive actions from China or anyone else. So, yeah.
I'll take one from over here, yeah, and then go back, yeah. The front row and then the second row, and I'll come back to you. Yeah.
Could you compare and contrast the policies in this arena between the Trump administration and the Biden administration?
Sure. Well, to a degree, there has been a lot of continuity, I think, between on China policy, on Indo-Pacific policy, between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and it might come as a surprise to you to hear someone say that, but I see that very clearly. and not copycat, but just a rolling forward of the policies, continued implementation of them. One difference, and then another, similarity and even expansion. One difference has been the approach to diplomacy. Not that, anyway, I'm not going to open any cans of worms. But the approach to diplomacy and the effort and intention of improving the diplomatic relationship between Washington and Beijing. It was intentional. There was great effort that went into that, and it took a while to get to it, remember, thanks to spy balloon incidents and other things. But eventually you had a very steady stream of cabinet officials going to Beijing to try to shore up diplomacy there. And that's fine. No, I don't have any problem with that. It's just a difference, just to sort of lay it out as an actual difference. The similarity and then expansion upon existing policy is, I'd say, a surprising continuation of tariffs. I didn't expect that after a great deal of criticism of tariffs on China from President Biden and the administration. That has continued. Export controls have continued and expanded. That's the expansion part. Have actually gone further than maybe not further, but I didn't expect that. And they are continuing. And I imagine we'll see more before the end of the year, no matter what happens on Tuesday. So a lot of similarities. And to the region as well, a difference, just to take it a step further, the attention, I probably skipped over that part, but the attention to alliances from the Biden administration, feeling that these needed to be embraced and they needed to have Band-Aids and things from experiences with the Trump administration. Definitely seen that approach, and I think that's I commend that. Nothing wrong with that at all. I think that's great and important, and has produced very good results. So that'd be my answer.
Great. In the second row?
First of all, thank you for coming and thank you for your insightful presentation today. Actually, I have a question about the North Korea. North Korea is a big, especially the Kim Jong-un, his recent behavior is becoming more and more dangerous and bold. Including a handful of test launches of missiles. Just a few hours ago, there was a breaking news that the North Korea has tested ICBM. And also recently, he's sending troops to Russia. And this kind of recent Kim Jong-un's behavior looks very dangerous. However, despite his desperate moves, the North Korea hasn't have much attention from the United States as he expected. So, how do you assess when the new administration comes after the election? How do you assess that whether North Korea can be on the top of the priority list to the U.S. foreign policy, because globally there are so many imminent conflicts and wars, including happening in Middle East and Ukraine and so on. So how do you assess the North Korea's position in the next U.S. administration?
Thank you, Hyuna. Great question. I have to say that I don't miss the 3 a.m. calls on ICBM tests anymore. That was one thing that I don't miss about public service on North Korea issues. Any of the things that North Korea has done in the past year and a half, this is not the only ICBM test, I haven't seen that report yet, but this isn't the only one they've done in the past 2 years, right? 2 or 3 years. No nuclear test yet, but maybe we will see that finally, the 7th nuclear test finally. But any of these actions would have been a major development, a breaking news development in U.S., both in the United States, at the UN Security Council, and among partners and allies. And you said it. Why? Because there are other forest fire, dumpster fire, there are other fires burning massively on the planet that are very urgent and need urgent attention. However, the Biden administration, it's not for a lack of trying to reach out to North Korea, to engage North Korea. Our option, and so that has gone unanswered. You can just deduce that their efforts to engage have gone unanswered. There are reasons for that, but why? Is it that they are ignoring the issue? No, I don't think so. I think it's that our options are very poor at the moment, and we talked a little bit about that with Steph's first questions. But our policy options are very difficult. To come to the other piece of your question, what happens in new administration, whatever that looks like, depends on a lot of things. The other sort of second or third most asked question is Donald Trump going to meet with Kim Jong-un? No matter where I go, I'm going to get that question. I don't know the answer. I think and even if he does, what is that going to produce? What is North Korea going to be bringing to the table if Kim Jong-un decides to sit down with either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? What are they going to be bringing to the table? I posit that they're going to be bringing, their new status as a nuclear weapon state, to the table, and not wanting to trade that card for much of anything, which takes us back to how you build leverage again. So very difficult, fraught with all kinds of complexity. Not to mention, that Kim's own sort of idea of who he is and what North Korea is. You didn't ask about this, but it's implicit and it's involved in the question. The renunciation of unification as a state goal. It's tearing up of the arch of unification, or whatever they call it in Pyongyang. All of that, the terrible things they're doing by sending trash balloons, all of those things. Kim is moving away, I think, moving away from the North Korea of the past and the backwards looking, maybe in his mind, towards always looking back towards let's have family engagements, family unification. Let's think about unification. No, he's going forward. He's thinking modernizing. What does a modern North Korea look like? It's maybe it looks more like Russia, maybe it looks more like China, but I think that's what's happening. You didn't ask for that, but that's kind of part of the answer.
Well, that's an appropriately pessimistic conclusion, I think, which is, I personally think is warranted. I'm sorry, I know there's a question over there, but I think we want to give a chance for people to sort of mingle. So if you come up, I can introduce you to Allison. You can ask the question directly. But thanks very much to all of you for coming. There is a light reception in the back, and Allison's going to stay around for another half hour in case you want to talk to her. But Allison, thanks so much for coming, and not just for this event, but for all that you've done with the students.
Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Thanks.